we are never truly lost. Well, okay, sure, maybe we get turned around for a few days in the woods, where life just feels like it's getting the best of us, and everything's going wrong. And I'm Mike Martin, and I've stood right where you're standing, lost, beaten down, like nothing's ever gonna change. And that's why I built this camp. And that's why I'm inviting you to join me and all the members of this wild community. Because you know what, friend? It does get better. So come along with me into the wild and let me show you this awesome, unique skill set that lays within inside of you. With help from the land, we're gonna unlock the steward that's inside each and every one of us that will lead the way out of the darkness and into healing. Here at the Camp of Healing on Project Mindfully Outdoors. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Project Mindfully Outdoors, the campfire sessions. And as always, I'm your host and your guide, Mike Martin. And I got to thank you for tuning in this week because I've got another really good conversation for you. And, getting ready for this new season, it seems like that's really what the medicine is lined up, is all these really cool and unique perspectives on, really the fundamentals that this whole backwoods philosophy and self-growth is built on. And my guest today came to me via, an old friend that I featured back on episode 293. He goes by the name of Jonathan Dryden. And, if you haven't had an opportunity to check that episode out, or even to check out Jonathan's podcast, I highly suggest that you do. I'll link to both of those in the show notes. But, recently Jonathan reached out to me about having a good buddy of his named Paul Granger on the show. So, of course, I was like, sure, yeah, I'd love to bring him on. And I'm really glad that I did. Because, this guy, he not only works in the podcast industry as well, but Paul brings that really spiritual aspect to the table, being that he's a preacher. So I figured, this was going to be one of those really cool kind of conversations that was really able to expand upon and add some new vocabulary to the narrative that I really like to work with. And, I was really excited. I mean, we had a couple of technical difficulties and, it was a little bit of a headache putting it together, but I think this conversation came out really good. And I think it's one of those ones that's really going to help to expand the idea of animal medicine and exactly what the animal totems represent. So on the flip side of this word from our sponsor, I'm going to go ahead and give you this conversation with Paul Granger. Enjoy. This episode is brought to you by our friends at My Medic. And as you know, this is a partnership that means a great deal to me because there's so much authenticity within their mission of providing state-of-the-art first aid equipment and putting the power in your hands when those events arise that are so dispowering. Listen, we all love walking around thinking that emergencies will never happen to us. However, My Medic was founded on an event that cost their loved one their life.
because they were unprepared. So don't make the same mistake. Buy now and live later. And when you visit mymedic.com, use promo code PROJECTOUTDOORS15 to save yourself 15% on your entire order. So swing over to mymedic.com and use promo code PROJECTOUTDOORS15 right now.
All right, so let's try this one more time between bad connections and all this crazy animal totem medicine that's going on this week. I'm sure this is going to turn out pretty interesting. But I shared with you the week that I'm having as far as this engagement with animals, and these signs that push us forward as far as like that we're moving in this direction. And with the snake being a great example, as you progress down those trails, you shed things, you shed layers of yourself. And, be it regardless your background or your religious belief system or anything like that, we all look for these sort of things. We all look for these pillars or these signs that say we're trying to go the right way. Curious about how you view that sort of.
Yeah. What's unfortunate is that the people missed it. You and I had the most perfect conversation around this, and we answered all the questions and solved every. No, I'm joking. It's one of the big things that you and I did talk about, though, was this idea of openness. And, there are many ways that people could engage something like what you're talking about. And somebody who believes that all we have is this life and our bodies and our minds and our understanding could hear something like that and feel like it's a stretch. And meanwhile, somebody else could believe that there actually is something way beyond us, and they could see things and everything, even if there isn't anything in there, right? So there's this wide spectrum. And, I identify as a Christ follower, and I see that within Christianity as well. There are Christians that don't believe there's much outside of it. They'll believe in God, but like, if something happens, they don't attribute it to anything other than that's just life. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, there are Christians who will attribute every single thing to being God doing something or the enemy doing something, and so it can be tricky when you see all these different ways that people engage. It can raise a question in your mind, well, how am I supposed to engage these moments? And where I found myself is really pressing into the recognizing the importance of openness, of what it means to acknowledge that there's a limit to what I know. There's a limit to what I've experienced. There's a limit to what I can see ahead. And that there could be something beyond myself that could bring understanding, could bring depth, that could bring meaning. And so I've had moments in my life where I can look back now and recognize a certain thing that happened. I could have just brushed it off as a coincidence or an unfortunate thing or a fortunate thing. But there is something about it that made me feel like there's meaning here. At the very least, maybe I need to pause, right? Maybe I need to think about this. Maybe I need to reflect on this. Maybe I need to marinate on this. Because if there is something beyond us, beyond just our bodies and our minds and our understanding, then it's a fair assumption that there could be external influences that are bringing meaning, that are bringing value. And so the big question is then, how do we navigate that? How do we discern between an everyday occurrence and something with deeper meaning? How do we know when we're pressing into it deep enough, or when we're just kind of skirting the surface because we don't really want to go deep because we don't like what we'll find, right? And so I think there's a healthiness to being able to just stop sometimes and say, let me just think about what just happened here. A snake came across the water and stared at me. And then, it's like, I could just brush this off, but is there something here? Um, for me, from a faith standpoint, if I believe that God is present and active, if I believe that he could still speak, But if I'm not actually looking for it or listening, then what do I actually believe? So if I actually believe that, then it means I need to have an openness, an awareness, a willingness to pause sometimes and say, could there be something deeper here than what I'm assuming?
You know, you bring up so many really good points in that, and I keep drawing back to where one would find that closed mind sort of mindset or
Mm-hmm.
approach, and that based off of fear. Because I know, looking back, I can think of moments that I probably missed a lot of signs that probably would have steered me in different directions, just out of fear of feeling so small and insignificant in the world that you're standing, that to realize some greater force out there could put something in front of you in order to
Mm-hmm.
be able to kind of guide you or direct you, it
Mm-hmm.
is a pretty damn scary idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now, looking back at the weekend that I shared with you before we hit record, and thinking that all those little all those little stones are kind of charting a path, right? And they come within a way that is comfortable. It feels safe to you. When these happen, because we all, like we said, we're all looking for direction, right? That's why
Mm-hmm.
we turn to religion. That's why we turn to spirituality. That's why we follow something in a book or a view that we agree with,
Mm-hmm.
because it feels safe to us. And whatever that force is out there that created everything understands that, because they're the one that put that within the makeup that we have and our ability to tell stories. They're going to utilize the things that you feel safe with, because each one of those things, I believe, are planted in front of you because it's prescribed exclusively for you. So therefore, why would it not be a part of the context that you're familiar with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I think of one thing in scripture that it brings to mind is there's a passage that's like sometimes it equates when Paul or Peter or others are writing letters, they'll equate the believers that they're talking to spiritual infants or spiritual children. And there's one point where Paul's like, "Look, y'all weren't ready for the steak yet. So y'all are at a place you just need some spiritual milk." He's referring to like you wouldn't give a baby, a prime rib. Like they don't have the teeth, the jaw strength, like they can't handle it. And so uh, what he's recognizing is they were at a place where they needed something that uh, they could handle, and to build from there. And so it's like what you're saying. It's this sense of if there is an entity bigger than us or something beyond us that has a higher comprehension, then it's going to have an idea of what not just what we could handle, but what we're willing to engage. Because that's the other piece too. Is like you were talking about the fear, sometimes we don't want to press into something beyond our understanding because we don't know what we'll find, or we don't want to think that we don't know stuff, or you could keep on inserting things. But off that passage there is a point in which they're being invited to go from spiritual milk to steak, and like I think it's interesting. Like you talked about safety, and I laughed in my head a little bit because I think you're right that there are many people, particularly with the Bible, that are drawn to the Bible because there's a safety in it, a sense of okay, there's purpose to my life. There's something that's bigger than me that can help me. But I almost laughed because there's also a lot in Scripture that has had kind of the opposite effect on me, that hasn't felt safe. Because the more I press into what it means to follow Christ, the more I realize how much it will cost. This is something that Jesus talked about often, is like count the cost, and to follow me will cost you everything. And that is actually a point that can become a barricade for some people who maybe grew up their whole lives as Christians, when they start to see, oh, like this isn't just about a benevolent creator making my life easy and giving me things. Like this is about something bigger. Oh, this is something beyond just myself. I think where people hit it the hardest is in the area in which, before we started recording, you were talking about when suffering hits, when hardship hits, because it is really hard for us to navigate that and to make sense of it. Because there's this part of us that feels like bad things shouldn't happen. Like if I'm a generally good person, then bad things shouldn't happen. Like if I do something bad and something bad happens, all right, fine, that's on me. Um, but there are a whole lot of really good people that have had really bad things happen to them. And there are a whole lot of really good people who were trying to live a life that they thought was honoring to God that get hit with suffering. And that's when it becomes really interesting. Like how do we navigate that piece of it, you know?
See, I love the point is through that suffering. And there's a reason that I want to go down this path because, you know, regardless of your views and everything you're carrying in your backpack, that suffering, it goes in the backpack as well. And it adds up. And it starts to make you question everything. You know, why do I believe this if this is happening to me? Why am I even trying if this happens to me? You know, no matter what I do, I'm going to stumble over that log, fall face first, and, you know, crack my skull open or whatever the case may be. You know, we all build those stories because it is kind of a natural instinct to get caught up in that story of self-suffering. Because as much as you don't think about it at the time, that self-suffering that we do and the stories we build around it dates back to our ancestors, and that kept them alive. It kept them curious, and it kept them willing to pay attention to what was going on, and essentially it kept them from being complacent, right? And when you bring that back to us now, we miss all that stuff because the way we've tamed the world, we built it to our comforts, and we believe that because we've tamed the land and we've shaped it to what we think is supposed to be comfortable, we shouldn't have to deal with those impulses or those instincts that kept us alive when the world.
Yeah. I lost you a little bit at the end there, but I, I think I got the bulk of what you were saying. Um, and yeah, it's interesting. Like it's interesting how much we rebel against hardship, because whenever we are rebelling against hardship, there's this assumption that we're making, usually it's subconscious, that there exists a perfect life, that there exists a scenario in which nothing bad happens to us. Um, and we see it. If we're in a place where anytime something bad happens, we like get all worked up, that's the default belief we have, is that something bad shouldn't have happened. But, you know, you noted back before technology, back before medication, back before all these kind of things, uh, the generations before us had to navigate a really hard existence, right? Like if you get bit by a snake, you know there's a doctor somewhere that has the, you know, anti-venom stuff, right? Like if something happens to me, I know that there are answers. If I have a question, I could go on Google, and other people have had that question as well. But there are people that were so aware of the hardships of life that when those hardships hit, they were able to navigate them. Not all the time, but they were able to navigate them, I think, in a healthier way than we are, because, like you noted, we have this goal of creating lives of security and of comfort and of clarity, right? And here's what's funny: there was a whole bunch of people in this world that were living in that way, that believed that if they just worked hard enough, if they just thought hard enough, if they just figured things out, if they just saved enough, that they could secure their life. And then March 2020 hit, right? And the whole world shut down because of a pandemic. And regardless of what people feel about the pandemic, the reality is that it altered life on a global level. what people thought was secure, what people thought was clear, suddenly wasn't so much. What people were stocking their lives on, their security on, everything, in a moment, for a lot of them, it changed. And I laugh when I think about the sermon series in churches that were happening in January 2020, because I know for a fact that there were many pastors that were so excited for January 2020 because they were going to do a 2020 vision series. Because pastors like to play on words. So you got 2020 vision, you got vision for the church. It's 2020 the year. And so we're going to combine it. We're going to do 2020 vision as our sermon series. And a number of churches in January 2020 poured into, like, God, we want to be able to see more clearly. We want to be able to understand more clearly. And then the world changes, and a lot of people didn't want to look anymore. A lot of people didn't want to think about it anymore. And this is one of the really pivotal moments in hardship, is there will come a point where we have to decide, do we want to keep on moving forward? Or do we want to put a blinder on? And both are options. Running is also an option. But when we choose to have the bravery, sometimes the audacity, to step forward into the hardship, even though we have no idea why it's happening or what's happening or what's going to happen, we discover something like what you and I are talking about, that this life is actually bigger than us and our comfort and our plans. And when we have, it's almost like a gift of having our plans ripped from us, suddenly we realize, oh, but life actually is still going on. I thought life could only work in this certain way. But now on this end of it, I recognize that there is another path. Like, there is another opportunity. There's another future. And, you know, for Christians in particular, what can trip them up is they get the mindset that God only wants good things for them. But they get it in their minds in such a way that it is, nothing bad will ever happen to me. And they'll pull from like Jeremiah 29:11, which is, I know the plans I have for you, plans for you to prosper. And other passages that seem to indicate that God doesn't want us to go through hardship. But even in that, those passages aren't talking about one individual person. It's talking about a collective, a generational thing. So much of scripture is actually generationally minded. That passage in Jeremiah 29:11, when those words were spoken, there's another part that says, and after 70 years. So in other words, the people who are hearing this promise aren't going to experience it. They'll all be dead, right? Because 70 years is a lifetime. And so the promise was actually for something beyond them. And that's one thing that I'm coming to learn more and more, is that my life is for something beyond me. I could just live my life for myself and maybe do okay if all the things, fall into place. More likely, unexpected things will happen, like a pandemic or a car accident or a really bad snake bite, or, there's so much that we can't control in our lives, and yet we will operate as though we can control our lives. But if I live in such a way that I realize it's about more than just me, and that my life can actually be a way of loving others and serving others, then sometimes I can actually willingly endure hardship if I'm aware of the value that it's bringing to another. Parenting is a great example of it. Parents willingly choose to endure hardship that they wouldn't have had to if they just stayed childless, because they recognize how they're going to be able to invest in their kids or pour into their kids. Like, I would not have chosen to spend many years of my life touching other people's poop and dealing with tantrums and being told I'm mean. Like, I wouldn't want to put myself through that hardship, but I willingly do it because I know I have the opportunity to invest in my kids, to pour into my kids, to love my kids. And I'm able to recognize moments that are so valuable that they outweigh the hardship. When my little 4-year-old comes up and gives me a big hug or something, right? Like, I forget about the tantrum that he had, right? Because there's something bigger than ourselves and our own understanding and our own mindsets.
See, I love the way that you expressed all that, because it really ties in a lot to things that I've discovered through time in is when you take it away from those principles where it's what's the purpose of life, what's the meaning of this, what's the meaning of that, and you bring the picture into a smaller type of view, and you think about the impact that you can have. That's where I've really discovered how much practicing conservation within my own life expands that point of view, not only as a father, but also as a contributing member to the tribe. Because you look at, say, with, hunting and fishing, there's rules and regulations there for a reason. Sometimes it gets a little tempting to step over the line, but you realize that if you stay within that parameter, that next time there's going to be something better out there. And with bass fishing, it as a whole, it's the idea of catch and release, right? You catch the big old bass, you pull them in, you get the snappy little grip and grin, you throw him back, and he's there for the next generation. And I think that within life, especially within the concrete world, we lose sight of that idea, especially when we hit the hardship. If you look beyond that one single moment and you make the conscious decision that I'm here, I'm going to experience this, I'm going to snap a grip and grin, whether it's pretty or it's ugly, I'm going to contribute that to the tribe. I'm going to put that out there, put that energy out there. I think that really forwards a lot of bringing forth the value and the purpose that we each individually have. And I think that speaks really volumes to a lot of the reason that we become parents.
Yeah.
We're able to see it. We're able to see it on a small scale.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because parenting can give us that sense, again, like you said, on a small scale, of that deeper value, that value that's beyond just the norm, that makes it all worth it. Like I think of parents whose children are all grown up, right? And when they reflect back and they just realize that those 18, 20, 25, sometimes 30 years worth of like caring for their kids, they suddenly realize that there's this deep value that comes from it. And so it's like, that's a hard one for us because in the moment we can easily be only aware of what it is that we stand to lose. So, like catch and release, if someone doesn't have that communal mindset, they could just say, well, what's the value if I can't keep what I got? Or if like I want to eat this fish, like I don't understand, like they don't understand that it's like there is a value beyond them. Um, I think of the other, it's a small example, but it comes to my mind of times when I've been in group settings, particularly with uh, young teenage guys, where it's let's say it's a potluck meal, and it's time for everyone to eat, and everyone lines up, and all the teenage guys go up first, uh, and they just load up their plates because what they're thinking about is their hunger. They're thinking about what they see. We tend to like fill our plates more than we actually need to eat because we're like, I want this, this, and this. And they're not thinking necessarily of the people 10, 20 places back in the line who might not get anything now, right? Because it's like that individual thing versus like uh, one thing that I will try to do is if I recognize, okay, there's a whole lot of people here, I'm going to like hang back and let some of the people that I know might need the food more or might be hungry or whatever, my kids, or let them go first and then I'll come in the line after that. Recognizing there's a risk to that. I might not get the things, especially if I caught an eye of like the fried chicken. I'm like, oh, I really hope there's some of that left. And then it's gone. Like, but I know there's a deeper value because on one level, what I was willing to give up has benefited others. Like they are able to benefit because of what I release. But even bigger than that, it can have a communal impact. If everybody has that mindset, if everybody's saying, I am really hungry, but I'm only going to take what I actually need. Well, now everybody's happy because now I'm at the end of the line. I'm coming up to him like, oh, there's still fried chicken here. And I look and everyone only has one piece because they didn't load up their plate. And so I was having this conversation with a friend of mine, and he was talking about um, Native American culture and beliefs, and this idea of uh, a deeper understanding of what it means to engage with the world and with Earth, and then comparing it to now to how poorly we are caring for the world. And and he was talking about this idea of a communal understanding, that how can we live in such a way that it's not just for our comfort, but and it's not just for those around us, but it's for generations later. How can I make decisions now that will be healthy or positive for, 2 generations past, because I'm not just rushing forward and destroying the land around me. And so, and he's, I don't believe that he is a Christian, but that
And
there's this share. Oh, go ahead. I heard blips of it because it cut out.
oh,
What
I
did you
was going to
say?
say to bring that back. That was a problem I had too. But to bring that back to the very beginning of this conversation, that was a beautiful testimony of raccoon medicine. Because when you
Mm,
think about raccoon structure, you know, you see all the little raccoons that are playing around, getting their food, whatever. Meanwhile, the dominant raccoon is off to the side watching for danger and protecting
mm,
the group. And I think that that's something that by really focusing in and starting to be more generous, you're in a sense you're protecting one little piece of the pie when it comes to the whole community of the tribe. And if each one of us put a little bit more focus into that,
mhm.
can you imagine how much further, how much more progress we would make toward becoming honestly more balanced as a culture and as a society?
Mhm. Yeah. And, we could take it even further. So there's uh, the way of engaging in a healthy way, just the normal ways of living and how we're understanding that communally. But we could even push this into suffering, like we talked about, because our gut response to suffering is to get out of it. And then once we gotten out of it, I don't want to think about it anymore. I did an entire series on my podcast. It ended up being 52 episodes focused on the idea of suffering. It was called Sitting and Suffering, and it was 52 episodes navigating that idea. And story after story after story of people navigating some like just deep hardships. And what was really beautiful to me is, for sure, all of them had moments in the midst of it that they're like, why is this happening to me? Or I don't want this to happen to me. Or God, why aren't you fixing this? And why am I still suffering? But so many of them on this end of it have discovered something that they never would have pursued on their own, which is now they are not just discovering, but joyfully stepping into moments where they can sit in the suffering of others. Let's say they lost a child, right? There's one woman who came, and she had lost her child, and it was a really hard grieving process because they didn't really have anybody around them that understood. Everybody was just giving platitudes, and there weren't really books about how to navigate it. And so they felt alone and lost. And so they navigated it. But now there's so much they learned about how to sit in that space, how to grieve in a healthy way, how to carry that grief, possibly through your life in a way that doesn't diminish uh, your state of living. And now they're able to come alongside others who are at that early end of it, that feel alone, and not give them answers necessarily. Sometimes they can, but sometimes it's just the act of sitting and like being like, yeah, I understand what you're feeling. Sometimes they don't even have to say it. The person who's grieving just they lock eyes and they're like, you get where I'm at right now. And it's beautiful. Like, I imagine you've experienced this. I've experienced this moment where I'm in a place of deep hardship and I feel alone. And then I connect with someone who gets it. And it doesn't even matter what's said. Like, suddenly in feeling seen, I feel a peace even as the hardship's still there. I feel a hope even if I still don't know how it's going to get solved. And so this is another communal piece, is instead of running from suffering, instead of avoiding suffering, instead of like pretending the suffering never happened, How can we recognize the gift that we now have to be able to give to others who are currently in that space, who are currently navigating the same kind of struggles? But that comes with sacrifice, right? Because this woman could have taken a path of trying to avoid ever thinking about her child dying, and maybe could have sustained that in some way, right? Um, but in choosing to sit with someone who's lost their child, she is being forced to remember losing her own child. She's being forced to relive those things. And so it carries, like, it kind of taps back at some of the triggers and the trauma. But what she has discovered, what so many have discovered, is that it is worth it, because now they know that that person no longer feels alone. That person no longer feels unseen. That person no longer feels hopeless, because they have met someone who's further down the path that's saying, look, don't stop going. Like, I know how you felt. I felt like I couldn't go any further, but look, I can tell you, you can keep on going. I've had a number of folks that have reached the point of either considering suicide or actually attempting it, because that's the place that they felt like, I see no way to go any further on this path. And for many of them, some of them, it was God intervening in some like wild ways. For some others, it was a person being able to say, look, this isn't the end. Keep on going. Like, trust me, believe me. And that's the advice that a lot of them end up giving at the end of the conversation, is you're not alone. You can keep on going. Don't give up. There are times where we feel like we have to give up because we can't see any way forward. But it goes back to what you and I have already addressed multiple times, is it's possible that there is something beyond our understanding, something beyond our comprehension. You know, who you and I were 10, 20, 30 years ago, like, we recognize we know a whole lot more than those guys. Those guys probably thought they knew a lot, but we can look back and say, man, 20-year-old me thought he knew some things, but he really doesn't. And I feel like that's going to be the case 10 years from now, 20, 30, however many years. That version of me is going to have a deeper understanding, and yet isn't going to have full understanding. And so it's still going to have the opportunity to live into healthy openness, to live with a communal mindset, to engage beyond just my own self-preservation.
You know, I'm listening and I'm thinking throughout history, because I'm a history buff, and everything that we encounter is something that's been encountered many times before, whether it's, you know, somebody that I can physically connect with, or I can pick up a book, read a story, you know, whatever the case may be, whatever form of media or connection there is, it's there for support. And it brings to mind, I believe, one of the most beautiful passages out of Meditations, how when a soldier reaches a wall that they can't climb, it's not a second thought to reach up and have somebody help propel you over the wall. However, when you're in those hard moments, it can be very uncomfortable to look at somebody within the tribe or community and reach your hand up to be pulled forward. So, you know, as I mentioned, being a history buff, and there being many countless books out there, I feel like it's one of those things that's worth mentioning, because if you're uncomfortable with the space that you're in and you're trying to come out of it, there are other avenues that can, almost like a step stool. You know, if the hand is way up here, but you're down here and can't reach it, you can find a rock to stand on in order to leap up and grab the hand to pull you over the wall. There are tools out there within this creative force and world for that very reason. And I think that speaks beautifully to how we started this conversation about the sign, the pillars that we look for, you know, because we don't automatically just, if you have a love to read or not, pick up a book and turn to a page, whether it's Meditations or The Color of an Elephant or the Bible. You don't just pick up a book for some odd reason, right? You go there and you stumble onto these things. And as you read the words, or as you have a conversation with somebody, something clicks. And
Mhm.
that's the same thing as standing on the shore bank of a river, casting a rod and noticing this gigantic snake swimming across the river in your direction. When you're
Mhm.
wondering, is all of this struggle that I'm going through and all this hard work that I'm putting in, or at least think I'm investing in myself, is
Mhm.
it worth it?
Mhm.
And, you know, regardless of how you package whatever those signs are, they are there and they're intended for you. If it scares you, you've got to learn to be open and vulnerable. You got to
Mhm.
learn to look into the unknown, because as much comfort as you find within whatever form of, belief system that you have, how you express it and practice it,
Mhm.
there's still that uncomfortable unknown question, right? Is
Mhm.
this really the answer? And we all hit that
Yeah.
point at some point in life. Then
Yeah.
those magnificent spotlights happen
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
reinforce it.
Yeah. Well, and it's what's interesting is like we can get tripped up on is the sign that I'm seeing actually a sign? But I think a better question is, did this propel me to a healthier place? Right. Because I would much rather see something that I decide, well, that's not just a coincidence, and attribute it to something higher if it propels me in a healthier space than to just assume everything is coincidence and not move forward, right? So, like, um, as you're talking about the snake, it reminded me of one of the stories from my family and I won't tell it here because it's very long, but it is on my podcast if somebody wants to listen to it. But the house that we live in now is one that we never planned to get, didn't have the money to get. It was impossibly expensive. It needed a lot of work. I mean, it was an impossible house. And I had a clear sense one day that I felt like God was inviting us to pursue it and not promising that we would get it. And what followed was a 6-month process of impossibility after impossibility after impossibility, and moments where it's like, but I think God is working. Something would happen. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small. Sometimes it's like these sign things. Is that God or is that some just a coincidence? But we would engage those with an openness to be able to say, regardless of what this is, how can this impact how I move forward, how I respond? And there was one particular moment where after 6 months, we had to make a decision. Um, the sellers were being very stubborn around certain things that they shouldn't have been. If we moved forward with the house, it could be incredibly costly, and we didn't even know how we were going to pay for it. I mean, a really just ridiculous situation. And we went to this event, and the decorations all around us were houses, just houses and homes. And my wife and I left this event and hearing some of the things that were said during the event. It was celebrating a couple that had served in the community for like 15 years. And we just looked at each other and we just knew. And we're like, we're getting the house, aren't we? Like we're gonna say yes. um, and somebody could look at that and say, well, those were just decorations. Like, and maybe they were. Maybe God didn't plant those decorations just for my wife and I. But you know what did happen is we were open enough to allow that space to confront how we were thinking, to push us into questions, and to make a decision that we were struggling to make. And so, whether it was God doing it or it was just a coincidence, we ended up in a healthier place. And I think that's a big opportunity for us is to not get so tripped up on figuring things out, um, and instead just find comfort in the next best step forward. Uh, I mean, it's if somebody is hiking, they might want to know exactly where this trail is going to lead and how long it's going to be. But that can end up being an unenjoyable hike sometimes versus like I'm going to walk and I'm going to take in what's happening around me. I'm going to enjoy the beauty. If I'm just looking for the next marker, then I might not see the raccoons right in the side. I might not
Right?
see the squirrels playing. I might not see the flowers. We get so tripped up on trying to figure out what is supposed to happen that we don't actually live in the moment. And again, we can't control it. A pandemic can hit, job can be lost, car accident can happen. An infinite number of things that are external and uncontrollable to us can impact our lives. That could be a scary thing for somebody, but the reality is that should be a freeing thing, because when we own that, then we can say, therefore, I don't need to think that I can control all of this. So what can I control? And how can I move forward with a peace, knowing that even when the uncontrollable hits me, it doesn't have to destroy me?
I love that. I think that's actually a beautiful point to wrap this conversation up on.
Nice. Got the perfect closer.
Absolutely. I love when that happens. So before we wrap this up, you got to let people know not only where they can find the podcast, the name of it, but what else you got going on.
Yeah. So, I'm last 5 years, I haven't received a traditional paycheck. I've been full-time ministry in a lot of, constantly changing ways. For anybody that's watching, I'm trying to point. There's a sign here that my wife made for me that says "holding things loosely." That's been my life the last 5 years. Is I might have a sense of what I think God's invited me to. I might have a sense of what I want to do, and I'm going to hold it all loosely because there's been a lot of uncertainty, a lot of changes. But because of that mindset, I've been able to experience some beautiful things the last 5 years. And one of those is this honing of my sense of what I'm meant to do with my life. And that is to create authentic, accessible spaces. What you and I have demonstrated is people are processing things. We've got questions, we've got concerns, and we don't always create healthy spaces like what you're doing to process these. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is create authentic, accessible spaces so that if people particularly have some concerns or questions about God, or want to celebrate something God's done, or have questions about life, or whatever it is, that they can find a space to process that. So the podcast is one. If you go to wheredidyousee.god.com, you can find the podcast there, things that I've written, some books that I've written, devotionals. I just put 3 out today that I had written before, and I got really energized and just put them self-published on Amazon because I'm like, I can. And you can find the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, but I don't really like to self-promote because I don't want it to be about me and my content. What I really want is for nobody to ever have to feel like they're alone in what they're wrestling through. So again, I have a series, Sitting in Suffering, where if somebody feels like they're suffering, there's probably a story in there that you could resonate with. That's my hope. And I am fine if I never hear any results from it, right? If I don't get the accolades or anything, if I die and feel like nobody ever listened, but the reality is that people were impacted, I'm okay with that. Because at the end of the day, I want people to know that they aren't alone, that you are not, I'm saying this to the listener, you are not alone, no matter what you're struggling with. And my hope is if I can be at least one person to walk with you in it, then I'm game. So here I am.
It's a beautiful message. I mean, I took running sponsorship that required I was on social media and had a presence and ran the exact same thing for that very reason. I've been there alone.
Yeah.
And when you're there alone, it can be some of the darkest water to tread.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is, feeling that way is unacceptable on the overall big scheme of things, because there is somebody out there that can step in and make sure you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're willing or unwilling, whatever the case may be. Because I know myself, even to this day, I still fight it. I still fight that urge to go be as confined as possible and alone, because it's just part of depression and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes habit. But if you're sitting there in that same boat, understand that it doesn't have to be that way.
Mhm.
You know, you can open the door and you can
Yeah.
come out of whatever confined space you feel you're in.
Yeah.
It's something that it's okay to struggle with. You don't have to run. You know,
Mhm. Mhm.
even miles down the trail, you don't have to run.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can stumble as much as you need to.
Yeah.
It's just understanding that it is an option.
Mhm.
You can come out and you can, in fact, you belong. By
Yeah.
being alive, you are entitled to be a part of this tribe.
Mhm.
And you know, it is what it is for that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
Paul, this has been beautiful. I mean, there's so much more that I wanted to dive into, and I hope we can get together again real soon.
Yeah, I'm game. I love these kind of conversations. They're so important. So thank you for creating this kind of space.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. That is it. That is all. And that is the end. We have reached the end of this week's edition of the Campfire Sessions. And I think one thing that really struck me about during my conversation with Paul is the fact that in reality, when it comes down to building a narrative or a perspective, uncovering a path that we're going to walk, regardless of what sort of inspiration or directionary signs we look for, there is no right or wrong within the answer. It's about creating a path and a framework that really works uniquely for you. Because after all, you are the one that's walking the path. You can draw from really, whether it's nature or history, regardless of the context or the source, it's only an outline. The responsibility falls within each one of us to define exactly what that framework looks like for each and every individual journey. So keep that in mind as you travel through the day. You know, whatever it is you encounter, it's got to be an output and an outcome that works for you and that comes from a framework that you're comfortable with. So until next time, my friends, get out there in the wild. It's where the stillness and the adventure lies. See you. Hey, friend, it's Mike. And before I let you go, I just want to thank you one more time for tuning in. This isn't about trying to sell you anything or anything like that. This is sincerely just to say thank you for being here along this journey and taking the time to be a part of this camp. And I'd like to invite you over to projectmindfully-outdoors.co to sign up for the newsletter, where we dive a little bit deeper into each and every individual episode and meditation, along with a lot of extra special features. So I'll see you though over at projectmindfully-outdoors.co. Until next time, we'll talk soon.